Hello and welcome to the 10th installment in this Twitter integration video series. In this video I'd like to cover how to create and define a dialog for managing tweets. This includes a tweet submission, retweeting existing tweets, as well as other behaviors. I'll demonstrate some JavaScript functionality to control the behavior of the elements on the dialog. For example, I'll show you how to use JavaScript in order to control the characters left count. I'll also demonstrate some JavaScript to show you how to change the color of the text if it exceeds the 140 character count. I'll also demonstrate how to use a data handler in order to persist this tweet using the DimeBrains TweetSharp library. So let's go ahead, we'll switch over to Visual Studio and get started. If you remember back in the second video of this series, we were in the Esso application configuration file, and we declared the one page and the two dialogues that we're going to be using in this application. The dialog that we're going to begin to create now is the Twitter entry dialog. So we have that file, but as you can see it's empty, stored inside our 6web3385 folder. So now we're going to go ahead and begin to populate this page definition in order to define our tweet dialog. I'm going to go ahead and just paste some code in here, and this shows you the bare bones page definition. So I've created a new page element. Inside there I've given it an ID of the page name. I've given it a title. I'm not actually doing any binding to resources, so I can go ahead and delete that. We're just going to hard code in the title of that dialog here, tweet dialog. We have a data section here defined where we're still going to continue to use the data handler for this Twitter application, the Twitter data handler. And now it actually breaks down into defining the panels that we're going to display inside this dialog. The type of the panel is going to be an Esso dialog panel. I'll just paste this in here, a panel, give it an ID, Twitter entry dialog. It's of type Esso dialog panel. I'm going to specify an Esso protocol for that panel so that I can address the dialog itself, and the panel type will be a main panel type. Now within this panel we have to begin to define some cards. So go ahead and type in a cards element, and then we'll begin to specify a single card. The card type we're going to use is also Esso dialog card type, so it's also a dialog type, if you will. And then within a card we have to specify some views. So we'll specify views. For this card we're going to specify its ID is Twitter card. Its type again is Esso dialog card. We're going to define a placeholder ID called dialog card placeholder. Nothing special. And then finally a card type equal to main card. We're going to display a single view, and in this case we're going to give it an ID called Twitter view. Its type is going to be Esso plain view. For this view we'll specify the Esso protocol equal to main, and a current that's assigned to this view will be the tweet for the tweet ID, etc. I'll just close this off. Now, because we have a single view inside a card type Esso dialog card, that expects us to actually provide some parameters for the config section of that card. So let's go ahead and specify a config section element, and then we're going to populate it with some view properties. We have the capability to specify the header, main body, and footer views. In this case all we're going to specify is in fact the header view. So I'll specify that by simply creating a new element called header view, and because you can have more than one header view, that's actually plural. And then the only way to actually define the view inside this header views element is to specify a view ref element. And inside there we'll specify the ID of our view, So we'll say Twitter view. Underneath that header views element, we'll also specify an only visible views element, and we'll say true. Also in the card section is where you specify the data handler that is responsible for managing the save operations for the controls in this card. So I'll go ahead and I'll paste that in, and the data handler that we're going to use to save is in fact our defined entity data handler at the top, which then falls back to our Twitter data handler. Okay? Now it comes back to actually defining the controls that we want to see in our dialog. For that, I'll come back up to the view element and begin to define a control group. It's a single control group. And then let's go ahead and specify some parameters for this control group. We'll come up here, we'll give it the ID, we'll say Twitter header group. It's of type Esso control group. It's position absolute, left, top, and right parameters. And then within this control group, let's go ahead and just define a simple control such as a label and see if we can see that by opening the dialog. And I'll specify a controls section, controls element, oops, controls, and then specify a single control. In this control, we're going to give it an ID equal to, let's say, Twitter label control. We'll specify the type equal to Esso label. Great. The only property for a label is the caption. So we'll specify a caption, and we'll simply say, what are you doing? Great. So now I'm going to switch back over to the website and take a look. We have this add button that we can click on and execute some sort of action. I wanted to open our new tweet entry dialog. So I'll switch back over to Visual Studio, and I will navigate to the Esso Twitter page. I'll scroll down, and we want to look at that first toolbar button, and we can see I've changed the code here in the onClick event to execute some JavaScript. It's going to call dialog open and then pass in the name of the dialog, Twitter entry dialog, and then I'll specify the actual Esso protocol for this dialog, Twitter entry dialog, and then how I want it to behave. I'll say dialog equals stop so that it stays open. I'll address the main Esso protocol element, which is the first view. I'll say new equals true because this is in fact a new tweet. I'll specify a tweet ID equal to 0, so this will actually update the current, and I'll specify the tweet name equal to 0, and that will also update the current tweet name property. And then the callback in this dialog open method will be to, when the dialog closes, to refresh the archive control, which executes by calling Twitter archive control dot refresh list. This is not something we needed to actually create. This is something that the framework does for us. It will automatically create this JavaScript method with this naming convention. So as long as we know the name of our archive control, we just have to change this text here, and the framework will know how to refresh a particular archive control by specifying a control by that naming convention. Whatever the archive control's name is, followed by archive control dot refresh list. So let's go back to our instance of the website, and I'll click on the add button, and we see a single dialog called tweet dialog with a single label saying, what are you doing? Okay, so I'll close this. Now I'll switch back over to Visual Studio, and I'll take a minute to fill in a few more controls that I can begin to explain. So I've added a few controls, now let's talk about them. Underneath our label control, I have this Twitter count label control, and this is simply another label. I have it positioned over to the right of the dialog, And this will simply say characters left, and then it's going to point to the next label that's going to be positioned right beside it, and this label is going to be used in order to contain the number of characters left to type. Next, we have the Twitter text control, and this is a text box that we're going to actually write our text into. Very important, we have to specify the data source and drill down into our data handler Twitter entity carrier object that's in the data carrier collection. We're going to drill into its status property, which is a Twitter status data type, and that has a text property. So we're going to data bind this text box to that object's property so that we can get any values in this control based on that property, or take the text in this text box and persist them or save them to that text property. And then we can access it in the data handler save method and persist that as we need. In the config section of this text box, I'm going to specify that this text box is multi-line and that its max length should be 140 characters. This value will be checked for validation when the dialog performs a save operation. So let's go ahead, I'll save these changes, and then I'll come back to the website and we'll see if we can now see those changes in the dialog. So I'll click on add, we'll get the new dialog, and we see some of the position is not as I would expect. I would say, what are you doing? And I would expect that to be actually where the 0 is now. And then characters left and 0 I would expect to be positioned over here to the right. So I'm going to leave this dialog open, but I'm going to switch back to our Visual Studio environment and take a look at our actual control group definition. So I'm going to go down to the very end, and just before we close off the control group element, I'm going to add in a config section in order to specify how I want this control group to behave. So I'll say config, and then within that config I'll say group type equal to absolute. So let's go back to the page, and I'll right click and I'll reload this, and we'll see the changes for how the controls within that control group behave. Now everything is being positioned in an absolute manner. What I want to accomplish next is actually changing this 0 value equal to the number of characters we have left to type for a valid tweet. So if you can see, if I type something here in the text box now, this characters left value is not incrementing or decrementing. So let's go ahead and fix that now. I'm going to come back over into Visual Studio, and underneath our last control, the text box, I'm going to go ahead and add in an Esso script control that has this type of functionality. So I'll just paste in some code here that I had on the clipboard, and as I said, we're going to add in this script control. I'll give it an ID called Twitter count script. And you can see we're using this switch case syntax again. Essentially what this means is when the value 1 equals 1, which is going to be every time that this dialog is opened, go ahead and execute this JavaScript code defined. What we're doing here is I'm using the Esso helper JavaScript type, and I'm calling its getElementByEssoID method. I'm going to pass in the name of our control that we want to get the value from, which is up here, our Twitter text control. Next I'm going to leverage the observe method of the prototype library that we currently use inside 6web. So on the keyUp event, I want to call the updateCount JavaScript method, which we define here. In the updateCount method, I'm going to get the text control as well as the count control. So we have these two elements in order to work with. That is, I want the text box, and then I want this Twitter text count control label control. With that, I'll access the text controls value and then length. I'll get the number of characters. I'll subtract that length, and based on that I'll go ahead and populate the inner HTML property of the count control. If it's less than 0, then I'm going to go ahead and again use the prototype library to set the style for those controls. Otherwise, I'll set the style back to nothing. Finally, as soon as this JavaScript is interpreted, then I'll go ahead and have it execute the update count method, so that if there is in fact already text in that property or in that text box, then it will go ahead and update the Twitter text count control with the appropriate value. So let's go ahead and save this. We'll come back to the website. I'll just refresh the page and I'll begin to type in some text, and you can see that the characters left count is in fact updated. If I paste in some text here, a little bit more than it expects, you can see that the code or the color is in fact changing as we expect. So that's good. Now the only thing left to do is define the save or cancel button that will invoke the data handler if it is in fact we click on save or OK, and see how that behaves. So I'll close this, then we'll come back to the file, the code file for Esso Twitter entry dialog page. And finally, I'm going to leverage a built-in type known as the OK cancel button bar, and that's always maintained inside its own control group. So right below the only control group that we've defined thus far, I'll add in a new control group, and let's go ahead and talk about its definition. This control group has an ID called dialog button bar. It's of type OK cancel button bar, and then there is the absolute positioning attributes we've defined in that element. Be aware that you can specify a data source for control groups if you were in fact to create your own control group. So you can specify a data source for that, and the framework would data bind your control with the value you specify here in the data source element, just like you do for the individual controls above. The config section for an OK cancel button bar also can take in an entity current, the edit mode that this control will be in. Everything in a dialog is in fact always in edit mode. We're going to specify the OK button text. We're going to pull this from a resource just to say button save. We don't want to show the help button, so we're not going to define anything extra here. On the cancel button, we're going to actually utilize just the built-in functionality of the framework. I'm not going to change anything here. I'm not going to change any custom behaviors when I click on OK or when I click on save. So this is the standard default behavior. You'll see this used throughout the framework. It's just cancel on a click, and it's going to be callback equal false, and then it will just call the dialog close method. On OK, or when we click on the save button, it's going to simply call dialog dot close with callback, which will actually invoke the save method in the data handler defined as the data handlers to save in the data handler reference element down below. All of that will actually be orchestrated by the OK cancel button bar control itself. We don't actually have a delete button in this case, so we're not going to worry about that, and the control layout is going to be horizontal. So let's go ahead and save this value, and then we'll go back to the web page. If I click on add, we'll see that that in fact does appear. So that's great. It is working as we expect so far. Now what we need to do is drill down into the data handler and make sure that we have the code necessary in order to persist our changes for any new tweets. So I'll switch back over to Visual Studio. I'll open up our data handler. I'm going to scroll down to the save method, and you can see I've got this breakpoint already set up here. And that's good because I want to be able to catch and see the behavior that goes on when this save method is invoked. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on the debug menu, and I'll say attach to process. I'm going to go down to the actual IIS process, dub3, dub-p. I click on attach, and we should see this become a full circle. So we know that we are fully attached and that we can go down into this breakpoint. So we're on the website. I've got the dialog opened, and if I say, new tweet live from video series, and I click on save, that should invoke the data handler. First it's going to initialize the data handler. It's going to read in those definitions that we have defined in the config section of our data handler, defined all the way at the top, right? It's going to come in and get these values so that it knows how to look up in the database those actual values. Once that's executed, I'll just drill past that. Then it calls the save method, and now it's trying to get those actual values out into the data, into this credentials carrier data type. So I'll pass that. We'll see that we do in fact get those values. It gets the right values, and then it's going to make to see that our credentials exist, and then it's going to see if it actually contains a Twitter entity. So in fact it does contain a Twitter entity, and its value says new tweet live from video stream. So then it's going to drill down into this helper that I've created. I'm going to extract that Twitter carrier, and then it's going to use this Twitter helper in order to submit that tweet to Twitter. So I'm just going to blow past that. We'll see that it's going to call the callback, refresh the control, and here we see the actual tweet being rendered in our Twitter archive control. Live, real time, shows the source as from the web. If I create a new tab here and I scroll to Twitter to sign in, I'll say Esso DevNet, and then I'll use my DevNet credentials. I'll say sign in, and now you can see actually that tweet has in fact been created in Twitter. In the next video, I'm going to build on what we did in the previous video, which was defining the archive control menus and actions. So I'll continue to extend the functionality in the toolbar, as well as the functionality that you get when you right-click inside the archive control, right, and get these menus. So then I'll demonstrate how to do retweets, as well as direct messages and things of that nature. We'll talk more about refactoring the data handler and look more at the Twitter helper and see how that helps us execute those actions. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Happy programming.